And I think it's self-reinforcing. The more you're able to not just give in to the craving, often the more exuberance, gratification you can feel about your relationships, about your work, about life. Again, that inner freedom is so powerful and such a wonderful thing to have because you're not walking around terrified so much.
I dreamt that you were twisting through seven.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Soberful podcast. I am joined today by Dr. Kirk Schneider. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks very much, Veronica. Good to be here.
Dr. Schneider is the author of a book called Life Enhancing Anxiety. He is a psychologist with over 40 years of experience. And I just thought this is a fascinating subject to talk about. Give us an overview. What is life enhancing anxiety?
Well, I think we have a pretty good idea, first of all, of what anxiety is. I define it as the terror of the unknown. And it's very primal. It goes back to our earliest ancestry. It's got an adaptive function, evolutionary. I mean, it's a signal. We call it signal anxiety at that level. A signal that there's danger around, and there were real dangers, very physical dangers in our early times as humans. Obviously, you don't know if there's a tiger in the woods or what have you. So it alerts you to either fight or escape. But even more primal than that, I think it's something that is shared by all of us right from the beginning of life. A similar kind of, potentially adaptive signal. We think about the radical shift from relative non-being and unity with the mother and with creation to sudden abrupt being and pandemonium, basically, when we come out of the chute, so to speak, right? I agree with Otto Rank, who wrote The Trauma of Birth and really explored this problem very deeply, and there have been others since him. I think there are a number of psychoanalysts who really trace the template for virtually all future anxiety and trauma to that earliest moment where we are basically exposed to the chaos of the world and a kind of a scrambling mode that is such a contrast from where we were before, the passive receptive, safe and familiar womb. And here we are scrambling. We're sort of in a free fall. We're thrown into this world without the equipment, really, or just bare equipment and skills to deal with it. So the whole question of how we're met by our caretakers and by the culture is really critical from the beginning and ongoingly as we evolve as adults as well. So I think that's kind of the echo or the shadow in the background, the context in the background that makes it so hard to stay with anxiety, especially when we're particularly agitated or traumatized or re-traumatized, right? So we tend to grab for the easiest, quickest thing. And, that can be some distraction. That could be an addiction, certainly. You grab for the cigarette, for the drug, for the food, just to cover it over. We're in that scrambling mode. But here's the thing. What I call life-enhancing anxiety is another dimension of anxiety. And it's also powerful. Life-enhancing anxiety is the capacity to live with and make the best of the depth and mystery of existence. That's a kind of philosophical way to put it. Or to put it another way, it is the capacity to live on the edge of wonder and discovery as distinct from terror and overwhelm, which is what we experience in that primal mode, right? The terror and overwhelm, where we're scrambling, we're fighting, we're in that black hole of being out of control and in a desperate place to do anything we can to avoid any hint of that place. Well, if we get the appropriate connection with our caretakers, with the culture that surrounds us, that encounters us with relative understanding and support and appreciation for, the difficulty of being in that place, as opposed to a fear-based encounter, which is unfortunately what we too often meet with our caretakers and our culture, particularly in our Western world, I would say. But cultures like ours that are so good with the external, creating an environment that looks good and neat. We have a lot of high tech that at least gives us the illusion of power and control. And we have very, frankly, distracted parents, often distracted people in the culture who are coming more from that fear-based place, who have not really encountered this primal anxiety themselves. Sometimes that defensiveness and distracted way of being is transmitted over generations. So basically, we encounter a lot of defensiveness, rules and regulations, and the most destructive, I would say, is where the parental and cultural systems make us think that we're invulnerable. They give us a sort of grandiose way of seeing things, and basically they're doing everything they can to avoid any hint of vulnerability. And so we grow up thinking that we have to be these these supermen and women. We have to be godlike almost in our behavior, and in its most destructive mode, it turns us into tyrants, and it makes us very devaluing of the other and of that which is different, people, places, and things that are different. Again, going back to that primal place of scrambling, but we've never dealt with it, so we're just in this routine of kind of living these defensive illusions. Or we identify with leaders, religious, political leaders, cultural leaders, who embody this so-called greatness or grandiosity, and too many times they're destructive too, and also use scapegoats to pump themselves up and avoid this primal terror.
So you're saying, because I think we're living in the age of anxiety, and you're saying that anxiety is part of human functioning. It was
Yes.
part of our first real experience of life, which makes total sense. I've heard that theory before. I mean, we can't imagine the being in the womb and then not being in the womb,
Right.
especially if it's it's really there's a whole interesting concept there. So we are, I feel that we're living in the age of anxiety, but we actually have less and less to be anxious about. We don't have tigers we don't mostly have life-threatening things happening.
That's right.
So we've got to learn to live and manage our anxiety. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, that's right. And also to echo what you're saying, the closer we are to the radius of immediate danger, especially danger to life and limb or to family, all bets are off. It's very hard to develop what I call life-enhancing anxiety and fuller presence to oneself and feeling like one can be with these rather uncomfortable ideas, feelings, places, if you're about to be attacked.
Yeah.
And so that is an important distinction to keep in mind, especially for those people who are in war zones or very dangerous neighborhoods, etc. It is much, much tougher. However, for many of us, and even people maybe close to the radius of danger but not quite in it, we have a capacity to work with the anxiety and come into a more of a centered place, and a place where we can respond to the situation rather than just react. And I think we too often take that for granted. Well, partly because, again, we haven't really learned to deal with this very natural inner problem. So it's something that's extremely important, I think, to realize that we're almost in a race against time in a lot of ways, because I think that the less people develop the skills and equipment to deal with this primal anxiety and to come into the life-enhancing mode, the more we move toward actual physical threats and danger, because people are living in these very increasingly polarized ways, destructive ways, even though they don't have direct reasons to be that way. I mean, we see increasing destructiveness in the world, and it's a whole lot of it is unnecessary. If we could bring more people who are skilled in helping us work with these uncomfortable places.
Can you say more about that, working with the uncomfortable places? I agree with you. I think we are moving to a point where we think that we shouldn't ever be uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
I'm a former psychotherapist. So nobody enjoys discomfort, but it's so necessary. And I don't know, I don't know if you feel the same. I almost relish some discomfort because I know there's growth in it. And exactly. I love the growth. I want the growth. So I'm like, all right, I'll take the deal. Even though this is like, I know I'll look back and go, But I almost feel we're at a point where people believe they should never be uncomfortable or experience discomfort. And if they do, there's something wrong with them or something wrong and it needs to then be fixed. And that, do you feel the same?
Yes. Well, I think it's partly because of our quick fix, instant result world.
Yeah.
That we're living in more and more. And a lot of that's fueled by our technology.
Yeah.
And the seduction of our smartphones, our texting, our kind of instant ways of relating to each other, our ways of relating over electronic media, as distinct from learning the skills of being in the sweat and sort of intensity of person-to-person relationship. We're not learning those skills as much. Again, there's so much in our world that can give us the illusion of power and control, and it kind of sucks us into thinking that we don't have to deal with our vulnerabilities. We can live perfectly fine with our diversions, or living vicariously through, again, these celebrities or powerful cultural figures, etc. But we don't realize the price that we're paying, like you say. And one of the major prices is that we don't learn how to live a richer, more vital, and more free kind of life. I mean, what we're really talking about is developing inner freedom, the capacity to roam within, as I put it, thoughts, feelings, body sensations, imagining. So that can open us to a much more creative life and also ethically centered life, because we're more in tune with, we're more sensitive to ourselves and the world, and I think more appreciative of the gift of this time and space we have, and what really matters about life. How are you going to know about what really matters about life if you don't encounter some uncomfortable feelings and ideas and conversations with people too?
I love the concept of inner freedom. I talk about that a lot in terms of sobriety, that when we talk about freedom, it's not just freedom from alcohol, the obsession of alcohol, which is one type of freedom.
Right.
It's freedom in our minds.
Yeah.
Can you explain what you mean by inner freedom? Because I love that.
Well, I would say freedom in our whole body experience, not just our intellects, not just our behavior, our outward behavior, but with our whole body sense of life, meaning, and a capacity to, as I put it, reoccupy the parts of ourselves that we've blocked off for various reasons, often because of trauma or transmitted trauma over generations we're not even witting of. But it's a literally and figuratively a reoccupation project where we can feel more whole. So we can feel more deeply, we can think more deeply, we have a greater capacity to pause, to reflect, and to respond, as opposed to just react to people and situations. That's a really important distinction. I'm sure you're very aware of as a
Mm.
psychotherapist. I'm
Mm.
also a therapist for many years standing.
Mm.
And I went through a lot of this myself too. I mean, this is a lot of what I write about in the book, my own journey with anxiety and life-enhancing anxiety.
Mm.
And for me, it was a couple of very pivotal psychotherapies that helped me to work with these very harrowing places that began with a trauma in my childhood, which I won't belabor now.
Mm.
But to suffice it to say that for me, inner freedom is perhaps the greatest gift we can have as
100%.
human beings, because
100%.
it means you can be okay or relatively okay in a
Mm.
whole range of situations, and you can appreciate, you can have the time to savor your relationships or your creative projects or your
Mm.
work or
Mm.
your connections with your lovers, your friends, as opposed to skimming surfaces,
Yes.
because we're, again, in many ways subconsciously avoiding
Mm.
that depth. So, yeah, to me, a full life is the good, the bad, and the ugly. It's to be able to, the whole enchilada, if you want
Yeah.
to,
You are speaking my
food metaphor.
language. You are speaking my
Ah,
language. Um, so, living with managing our anxiety, living with our anxiety. I want to ask you how we approach that. So I used alcohol to manage my anxiety, which obviously is a disaster. And
mhm,
so many of the people listening to this and my clients, social anxiety is probably the number one reason that they
yeah,
drink, because they want to be social and connected, but they find it so terrifying. And then it just becomes this
yeah,
hamster wheel you can't get off of, because then you
that's right.
feel it makes it worse. And then a drink in the first hour or two makes it better, but it just keeps making everything worse. That was really hard for me when I stopped drinking, was just the anxiety was really acute.
Yeah.
And eventually it went away and got better. But what is the best way of approaching this so people can manage their
Well,
anxiety?
I mean, I dealt with a similar thing with obsessive compulsion. I think
Mm.
there are similar kinds of issues. Going
Yeah.
to something that, a ritual or whatever, that covers it up. It's a
Mm.
scrambling, it's a panicking mode, and it's again trying to get the quick fix so you don't have to deal with this discomfort. I would say discomfort in quotes, because that place could also be a gateway to a great deal of richness in living. But we don't know that at the time, right? Because we haven't developed the skills. So in my practice, if somebody is severely addicted to alcohol or drugs, I often really try to get a sense of whether they might need or could use an adjunct to the therapy to just get dry, a rehab center or something
Mm-hmm.
like
Mm.
that. Uh, uh, Almost more of a team approach than what can
Mm-hmm.
happen in that individual consulting room, because I find that people can be so overwhelmed by it they have to get to first base
Yeah, they have to
before they
be
can get to
sober to be
second,
able to
third.
deal with all of the stuff that's, yeah,
Right. And
yeah.
and so, but not to drop the therapy part,
Mm.
but to supplement it with something
Mm.
more intensive like that. So that's one thing. The other thing is we often start working with that pause between stimulus and reaction, right? So helping people to stay with the uncomfortable feelings that come up as they explore more deeply um, what is driving them to drink or to that drug. So helping them to explore that in the office by gradual invitations to see if you can stay with those feelings a little longer and what emerges as you stay with that very painful place, that hole that you feel, or that sense of uh, feeling like you're this piece of crap on the ground that people are kicking. What other thoughts, feelings, body sensations emerge as you stay with that? And again, this is depending on the client's desire and capacity to work at that level. But as
Mm.
people develop more ability to do that, that can be very powerful. I do a kind of somatic work with them to maybe identify places in their body that feel particularly blocked or tense around the issue, and to see if they can stay with that place, maybe even put their hand on the, let's say the tightness in their stomach, and see what else emerges, what other, especially feelings, body sensations, images that come up. So the point is that the more that we, at least for many people, that we can stay with the unfolding nature of psychic pain, the more we begin to see other aspects of it. It's like being in a dark basement and your eyes slowly adjusting to all those menacing objects out there. At least they feel and appear menacing at first. But if you can hang in there, you begin to see, well, that's something that, interests me, or I'm curious about that object, or that may even bring some fun in my life, to see that, or maybe it brings a frustration and a rage that, man, I'm just trapped in this place, and I don't want to be trapped here anymore. And I see the light, and I want to chase that light. So maybe even being able to be with one's righteous indignation is another angle on the situation. I want to break out of here. So that, I think that's a big part of working with the addiction, is practice. And it does take a lot of practice. You can practice in the consulting room. I often suggest that people take 15, 20 minutes during the week to just be present to what's charged at that moment. And it's often the issues that we're talking about in the therapy. And see if you can do the same thing, a kind of inner listening exercise of pausing and reflecting on what is emerging, but not fixating on any one thing. And doing it in a more mindful way, like you're watching objects float down a river, but seeing what's operating. And again, you're coming into the more of who you are. Yes, it's terrifying at that moment, but then, something else happens. I'm really pissed about that. I don't want to be there. Okay, so that's emerging. Or I'm feeling something is important about being in touch with myself, even though it's painful. It's poignant, it's moving. Okay, that's another thing. Or maybe something comes to mind about a relationship. That, I want to take a little bit more of a risk in that relationship. And that, of course, can happen in therapy as well. So the more that we can, again, reoccupy those parts that we blocked off in a whole bodily way, and the more practice we have at doing that, and the less compelled I believe we are to grab for that quick fix that we think is going to solve the problem, but we realize down deep it's not. And I think it's self-reinforcing. The more you're able to not just give in to the craving, often the more exuberance, gratification you can feel about your relationships, about your work, about life. Again, that inner freedom is so powerful and such a wonderful thing to have, because you're not walking around terrified so much.
I just want people to know that they can have inner freedom. I didn't have inner freedom, but I didn't even know it was a thing. I didn't know that was something that was possible. And once I got glimpses of it, it was like, it kind of changed everything. And yeah, it's what I call just feeling comfortable in your own skin.
Yes.
Right? It's not that everything's perfect and life doesn't have challenges and stuff. It's being comfortable in your own skin, and you'll know when you're not feeling. And I think when we feel uncomfortable in our skin, when we don't have inner freedom, we are looking for outside fixes to that, aren't we? We just you need something to ease the discomfort of that.
So even if you can implement a pause of a few seconds, as opposed to going right to that thing, the drug, the alcohol, that's a beginning. That's like a wedge that can expand. And so that's sometimes what I'll suggest to folks in the thrall of the addictions, is to see if you can, instead of just reacting right away, see if you can take just a few moments, maybe to breathe, So some simple breathing exercises can be helpful in that pose.
Mm.
And see what happens. Do you die instantly? What
Mm.
happens? That's often the ultimate fear, I think. We're talking
Mm.
about a kind of death anxiety in the
Mm.
most primal sense, of that groundlessness and helplessness that overwhelms us. And even the terror of the unknown is a kind of terror of being annihilated. And so, does that really happen? So there is a kind of disconfirmation element here too. Our fantasies, our fear fantasies, are often much greater or more menacing than the actual reality. And that's
Mm.
something one has to learn.
Mhm.
But this is, I don't want to make it sound like an easy or simple thing either. These are some techniques. There are methods that people can use on their own
Mhm.
to work with these difficult places, but it often takes a relationship,
Mm.
and a relationship with a healer who can support one to continue to revisit these very difficult places to the point where they're ready to break out of them.
Mm.
And that's something, again, in our culture that I think we need to learn about, that generally, if something is going to be really successful, it's going to take some work, but it's worth it. That's the other side. I want to convey that message, and I sense you're conveying that message. It's worth doing that inner work.
It's so worth it, and there's no other way. I don't see that there's any other way to what we all want. Actually, what we all want is inner freedom, even though a lot of people don't realize that's actually what they want. What they want is inner freedom. And there is no other way than to do the inner work. We are
Yes,
singing from the same hymn street there.
yes,
Yeah,
yes,
totally.
yes,
Yeah, yeah,
yes.
I
But
completely
of course,
agree.
the problem is it's expensive to enter into these kinds of deeper therapies and or
Mm,
longer term work. But I would do everything you can to be creative about that. There may be low cost counseling centers in your local community. There are psychological associations
mm,
that offer rosters of people who may be more flexible in their work, or
mm,
university counseling centers. And I don't want to pin it just to psychotherapy. I do think developing a meditative practice,
mm-hmm,
a disciplined way, could also be helpful.
mm-hmm.
People have found different sort of helpful situations or helpful witnesses that have been very powerful for them.
I have a theory that if we could all spend more time in nature moving our bodies,
Yes,
80% of mental health problems would be solved.
I'm with you that nature is a really significant healing
Mm,
environment, and
mm,
if it can really be there,
mm,
especially
mm,
be present again, developing
mm.
this presence, I believe, is critical to that inner freedom.
Do you think our anxiety is getting worse as a culture? Like you talk about our polarization. I mean, do you mean politically or in every way that's just
Yeah.
making our anxiety worse?
Well, I'm afraid that it's not just politically. It's individually. It's collectively. It relates to something I call the polarized mind, which is the fixation on a single point of view to the utter exclusion of competing points of view. And
Mm,
I think that is probably the main scourge of humanity since our
mm,
earliest days. Because again, I don't think we've ever been very good, at least in most places in the world, in the power centers of the world, at working with our vulnerability, at working with our anxiety, our inner
mm,
lives.
mm,
We're just now maybe coming into that more
mm.
as we've resolved a number of the basic physiological needs. But yeah, the polarized mind is a major problem across the board, and I do think we're becoming more and more anxious, precisely because we're not facing these deeper anxieties, and we're not developing the tools for them.
Mm,
And uh, if we're skimming surfaces, we come into situations that shake us, like traumatic situations or situations that we don't anticipate that shake our world, and suddenly we're overwhelmed.
Mm.
And I think that's happening a lot with individual psychological disturbances. At the cultural level, again, we seem to be looking for quick fixes and instant results from our leaders too often. And we're using means like weaponry and war and violence much too readily because we don't know how to have these uncomfortable conversations with each other and work with the contrasts and contradictions of a fuller life and fuller discovery in living. And so that's why I've been advocating what I call this experiential democracy dialogue, these bridge building dialogues between people of very contrasting cultural and political backgrounds, to provide at least some tools for people to become more present to themselves and to the other, the identified other, and to enter into what I'd call more humanizing conversations with each other, rather than conversations that are filled with stereotyping and labeling and reducing the other, just so we can avoid the vulnerability.
Yeah.
Hoping that spreads.
There's so many important things there about avoiding vulnerability. I used to do that all the time. The discomfort, the feeling uncomfortable. It's a skill, I think. It's a skill that we can begin to learn. But there's no other way to get what we want than to begin to go inside and to really know ourselves, isn't it? It's really, the ancient Greeks talked about that.
Yeah. I think for most people, you got to face the hard places. This whole idea of even exposure therapy. Exposure is such a significant part of healing, but not necessarily doing it in some of the really abrupt and radical ways that are advocated. But if one can do that even gradually, incrementally, develop greater and greater capacities to be with uncomfortable ideas, uncomfortable feelings, even in one's readings or in one's, watching of films or conversations with people. I think all that helps to feel more comfortable in your skin.
Thank you so much for joining us. This has been fascinating. Where can people find you and your work?
Well, they can check out my website, which is kirkjschneider.com. It's filled with all kinds of videos and examples from books, writings about this general topic. They can also go to, I have a new YouTube channel called Core of Depth Healers. Core like Peace Corps, CORPS, of Depth Healers, which provides examples of depth healers, experts in depth healing, who have translated their work to addressing social crises, like we were talking about before, bridge building dialogues, working with major social issues like gun violence, the pandemic, etc. And I recommend that they maybe check out Life Enhancing Anxiety, Key to a Sane World, which is available on Amazon and University Professors Press. So.
Great. We'll include all of those in the show notes and to the book as well. And yeah, your work sounds really, really necessary and is going to be really helpful for people to understand the role anxiety has in the human experience.
Much appreciated, Veronica. And I just hope it can help us move in a more sane direction.
Yeah.
Individually and collectively. And I've really appreciated our time together too.
You're welcome. And let me know, everybody, when this episode goes out on social media, what you thought and what your relationship with anxiety is as well. And by all means, please check out Dr. Schneider's work. And I'll be back next week. See you then, guys.